Charles Darwin is most noted for his theories on natural selection. His grandfather published a book offering scientific evidence that the Earth existed millions of years before man, refuting Genesis in the Bible. Charles expanded the work and published Principles of Geology, depicting the slow evolution of the Earth, hot, then Ice Age, etc. In December of 1831, Darwin left England to explore South America and the Pacific Islands. He studied life on the Galapagos Islands and the surrounding area and found variations of many species. Some species had died, and he asked why had that happened. In Origin of the Species in 1859, Darwin expands Malthus's idea on population growth. There is a natural struggle for life and constant evolution, and only the strongest survive. They in turn pass on their genetics to their offspring, etc. For example, the average height of a person in the year 1800 was about 9 inches less than today. If you travel through historic homes, you will notice how low the doors are. Darwin's ideas were also implied upon business, politics, and the nation-state. The victors of the war are the strongest. This idea also led many to believe in the white man's burden. Europe and America should colonize Latin America, Africa, and Asia because they are incapable of good government. This also legitimized the German, Austrian, and Russian claims on the Poles and the peoples of Eastern Europe. This was the absolute opposite of the freedom and equalities enshrined in the Enlightenment. Witness the rise of Nazism and fascism prior to World War II. Herbert Spencer, another British philosopher, denounced Stuart Mill's socialist ideas. He thought government should not interfere with business. Instead, the strongest and most fit business will survive and thereby strengthen the state in the process. If government helps the poor, then the poor will take advantage and never work to their potential. Herbert Spencer started social Darwinism. By the end of the late 19th century, a late modern outlook had emerged that challenged the Enlightenment tradition. One feature of this was irrationalism. Irrationalism rejected the Enlightenment values and Christian morality. In other words, people are bad, basically animals. Some are good and some are not. Ivan Pavlov was famous for his experiments with animals. Animal behavior could be understood as a series of trained responses to physical stimuli. Dog gets food for every time a bell rings. Eventually, when the bell rings, the dog salivates, anticipating food. This idea of behaviorism focused more on emotion for man, that he was affected by his environment. Friedrich Nietzsche attacked Christian beliefs. He suggested underneath Christian piety is man's animal nature for survival. We confess not to lie and cheat, however we still do. One should unshackle themselves from this and live life to its fullest. Nihilism is a belief that moral and social values have no validity. His beliefs focused on the Superman complex. A true Superman should lead his people upon his own beliefs. The vast majority of the populace are ignorant and should not be given the right to vote. Therefore, do away with universal suffrage and instead be governed by educated elites. This analysis brings about a lot of questions and misinterpretations of his views. First, what would society become if everyone did every irrational impulse? Rape, murder, and steal. What is left but anarchy? Nietzsche never fully explains. Also, Nietzsche did not favor racial nationalism. He thought if you extinguish religion and separate nationalities, a new master race will occur. For example, a German Jew and a French Catholic will merge and people will become Europeans rather than identify with a single country. Extremists such as Hitler twisted Nietzsche's views by promoting a German master race that caused the Holocaust. This is not what Nietzsche intended. Remember, he lived during the creation of Germany and thought that through war or an inspired elite, a new Europe could form. Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis. Freud, an Austrian Jew from Vienna, was also concerned with irrationalism. The previous irrationalists denounced scientific thought. However, Freud attempted to understand and explain man's behavior through scientific understanding. He saw that irrationalists had emphasized no limit for man's behavior, and Freud feared that man could go too far and become too violent. Freud concentrated on the subconscious mind. While a person can seem to be calm and in control on the surface, their subconscious is doing the opposite. Freud specialized in dealing with nervous disorders and found that numerous adults suffering from anxieties and disorders were caused by childhood experience, often sexually oriented. These emotions may be so traumatic that a person will force it into their subconscious realm. Freud suggested to treat these disorders, one must analyze where the real problem lies. He specialized in free association, or the premise that spontaneous and uninhibited talk reveals a person's underlying preoccupations that are at the root of the person's emotional distress. At the heart of this dynamic was the conflict between the id, or the subconscious, and the ego, reasonable conscious thought. The id constantly seeks gratification, while the ego subdues the id's urges. Constant denial brings anger, depression, and may lead to an emotional outburst. Freud was pessimistic for the future. He did not believe in heaven or Marx's vision of utopia. Instead, society is always changing, and there always will be conflict. He escaped Vienna following Hitler's annexation of Austria prior to World War II, and his 4 sisters were murdered due to their religion. Generally, all 3 of these psychologists were against organized religion. As I had mentioned, some people had twisted Nietzsche's views. Volkish thought was extreme nationalism. Volk is translated from folk in German. Germany was now the strongest economic power in Europe, and this brought about a surge of nationalism and patriotism. Conservatives applied this to social Darwinism. If one had blonde hair and blue eyes, you were a true German, a descendant of the ancient Aryans, who are believed to have migrated to Europe 4,000 years ago from the Caspian region. All other peoples in Germany that were non-German, Jews, Gypsies, etc., were regarded as racially inferior. Houston Stewart Chamberlain championed this thought. He wrote The Foundations of the 19th Century and argued that racial inequalities have been the driving force in history. Rome was great until it incorporated non-Romans as citizens. This weakened the empire from within. Therefore, a country should not allow immigration. Very different from the approach of the United States. He was especially hateful of the Jews. Around the same time, this would be part of Anti-Semitism, another name for being anti-Jewish, which had long simmered in Europe. The vast majority of Europeans were Christians. Early in the Renaissance, it was forbidden by Christians to loan money for a profit. Jews became affluent bankers and businessmen over the centuries, and people were jealous of their prosperity. Conservatives often blamed Jews on the woes of the country. In the early 1930s, German Jews were less than 1% of the German population. However, 11% of the doctors, 11% of the dentists, and almost 17% of all German lawyers were Jewish. Thus, they had more of a concentrated part of the wealth than German Protestants. This would lead to anti-Semitism in Germany. Due to the anti-Semitism in Europe, Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist, penned The Jewish State in 1896. He was one among many that called for a Jewish state in Palestine. Very few Jews lived in that area, while the majority were Muslim Palestinians. The vast majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, and were generally deprived financially, unlike the Jews in Western Europe. Herzl and others would want a Jewish state if they couldn't get in Palestine, perhaps even having a separate state in Africa or South America. They just wanted a state or an area totally for the Jewish people.